Cool. Excellent, excellent. All right. Have you guys met each other before?
No, we have not.
Oh, you gave a talk once to Mike's group,
Mm,
and that's the only contact we've had.
mm.
Fantastic. Yeah. So maybe take a couple minutes and introduce yourselves to each other. That's great.
But we will see each other, I think, at UCLA at that meeting in June.
Oh, great. Oh, good. You're going to be there in person.
Right, right.
Excellent. Uh, I started writing some notes about what do I want to talk to Chris Fields about, and it went on for a few pages, and I thought, okay, well, let's
Good.
just write like the top level vision, and it was still a page and a half. Uh, um, I am I'd like to develop a theory that links together cognition, evolution, adaptation, development, and computation, just those. And in particular, I would like to do it in a way that explains agential behavior and how mechanistic processes at a given level of organization can be more or less autonomous at that scale, but how that interacts with the scales above and below. And I've been quite excited recently about how that links with resonance as a form of error correction and as a mechanism that links together all of those things that I'm interested in. And its connection to error correcting codes is one of the topics that I think would be a good place to start. They are off the top of my head. That was that 8 pages I tried to summarize.
Well, we should make T-shirts for everyone who's interested in that set of topics. Not sure what we should call the group.
Yeah. But maybe Chris, say a little bit about your interests and what we've been working on, that kind of stuff.
Well, we've been interested in um, this intersection area between physics and cognitive science and biology, and in how to develop theoretical frameworks that are based very firmly in physics and that connect in a very natural way to computer science.
Yeah.
And that provide a nice formulation of what's going on in biology. But complementary to that, we're interested in how to import biological and cognitive thinking into physics in a kind of whole scale way.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to put all that is to see physics as fundamentally a theory of communication between agents who have some computational structure and who have to exist within an environment that exerts selective pressures of one kind or other. And of course, the environment in this case is an agent also that has its own agenda. And the free energy principle provides a nice way of formulating all of this, especially when it's translated into more quantum information language, which makes a lot of its structure a little bit clearer than it is in the classical language. And I suppose other aspects that physics helps to clarify is what context dependence is and how one goes about identifying and describing the contexts of actions. Whether the system of interest can identify those contexts or not. Typically, the system of interest can't. So one has all of these interesting kinds of context effects that are commonplace in biology and psychology. But
that's so figure and ground aspects of physics,
right? But the physics language provides a nice way to talk about formally.
Mike, do you want to stir it?
Yeah. So, lots of things I think would need to be discussed. One is this whole notion of the environment being an agent itself. I think is critical for all this, because typically speaking, as far as I know, in all of the biology models, we assume that the agency of the environment is zero. And that, okay, there might be some parasites and there might be some competitors or whatever, but the actual environment, it just, it's mechanical, it just is what it is. And so I'd love to kind of have us unpack that some more. And the whole error correction thing, I think, is critical, because all that I see in biology is constant error. So by the way, the one thing that Chris and I have been kind of developing lately is perspectives on all this kind of stuff that we talk about, but really centralizing the role of the observer, right? So this idea that everything is from the perspective of some observer. So anything, all the stuff that Chris says on that topic, with the reference frames and the observers and everything, I think would be super, super important to hear again, for me anyway.
Yeah. And we've spoken before, Mike, how that might intersect with how I've been thinking about orbits representing functions. So the dimensionality of the orbit tells you how many times the space is folded and the depth of the function class, and the chord that you cut across that orbit defines a function in that function space. But instead of cutting a simple cut, you could intersect that orbit with another orbit that was itself complex, so that it's like, what does one oscillator see of another oscillator? And when you do it that way, it's much more interesting, because in order for one orbit to sample another orbit, it necessarily needs to be at a similar frequency, and that makes it vulnerable to being modified itself, so that you can't just be an observer that doesn't influence the system, you're necessarily coupled with it.
Yeah, which to me, that immediately links to the notion of, as we talk about the cognition and all of that, but we also want to talk about first person perspective, right? Consciousness, so to speak. And to me, the interesting thing about that is that, unlike typical experiments that we may do, where you can do them in third person and you're not really changed much by them, you may learn something as a result, but typically, it's, you prepare some system and you just sort of stand there and watch it. But to me, I think any kind of experiments or any kind of science with respect to consciousness, you are the participant, like you have to participate. Otherwise, what you're learning about is physiology and behavior. If you're going to learn about consciousness, you're going to be involved in finding out what it's like or how to, whatever it is. And so that gets back to this thing that you just said, Richard, that you are, for those kind of experiments, you are fundamentally participating, altered by it, part of it. That's those things will all come into play if you're going to find out about the kind of the really core cognitive aspects of things.
It's like saying that you can't be an observer of consciousness. You can only just do consciousness. So the best that you can get to being an observer is things like sort of almost I was going to say looking in a mirror, but it's interacting with another consciousness that's like you, and how much of it can you see and how much does it affect you. You can't interact with it without being vulnerable to being changed by it. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right. It's like, if you think about what does a successful theory of consciousness output? It's not going to be behavioral data. It needs to be what. So what is it, right? It's what format does it give you as an answer to our questions? And I think it's got to be protocols for putting you into that same state so that you can really find out what it's like, right? So first person. Yeah. So C.S. Lewis said something like, I'm going to mangle it, but it was something like, don't tell me what it's like to be scared. Tell me something scary, and then I'll know. And so right. So these things are sort of like, anything else is a third person description. It's not consciousness. It's physiology. It's behavior. It's whatever. But if what is that? Poetry, art, I don't know, but some kind of a stimulus, right, that puts you into that same state. Well, now we know. Now we know what it's like.
So does that mean that a theory of consciousness is indistinguishable from an experience in the conscious state? That it's like, LSD is a theory of consciousness?
That's interesting. I mean, kind of, so a good theory of consciousness would be, so I produce some kind of crazy high brought with 3 brain hemispheres and some wheels and whatever, and I say, all right, with your theory of consciousness, tell me what it's like to be this agent. And the answer is, well, you need this much LSD, and then you need some, you need this experience, and we need to get, and then you have some prayer. I mean, I don't know that you could ever actually get it.
And I could tell you that recipe, but you're saying that isn't the theory of consciousness. That's just the interesting. There is a recipe for consciousness, not a theory of consciousness. You have to do it before you do it. Before you're the theory has to be, the ingredients have to be put into action before it's a theory.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that if you look at what actually passes for theories of consciousness in literature, they're not about what it's like at all. They're about, describe this entity. Thanks, and my theory will tell you what this entity can be conscious of.
Yeah.
Without saying a thing about what its consciousness of that is like. Beyond some, vague generalities, like its consciousness of this, it sort of feels stressful. Well, what does that mean? It means whatever it means to you. And you just project that onto the other system. So, we talk about E. coli being stressed by heat or lack of food or something like that. We say, well, stress feels like this to me, so maybe it feels something like that to E. coli.
So I wonder if that's an entry point where we could talk about the relationship between stress and harmonics in vibrating systems and its relationship to error correcting codes, and see if that resonates with you, Chris. So I've been thinking about the two-way relationship between oscillations and form and function. So the form and function of a tuning fork, sorry, not form and function, shape and form. The shape and form of a tuning fork, a particular macroscale geometry, determines the note that it rings at. But in the other direction is also possible, that a particular oscillation can create a shape and form that will hold that oscillation. So in that direction, I've been playing with Faraday waves and Faraday worms of oil on liquids floating on oil. And you vibrate the oil at a particular frequency, and the liquid droplets elongate and take a particular shape that is an integer number of wavelengths.
Mm.
So there's a two-way relationship there between what frequency does this shape vibrate at and what shape does this vibration make. And I noticed that there's the discontinuities are important, or the quantization of the shape and form is important. That there's it wouldn't be interesting if you just, you turn up the frequency and the worm gets longer, right? What's interesting is that you turn up the frequency and the worm's length increases in quanta, in integer multiples of the wavelength. So the connection to error correcting codes, I'm thinking about it as, there are certain modes which fit in a particular geometry, and the frequencies in between don't fit. They're excluded. They're not allowed, disallowed. And an error correcting code, crudely, is what you need for that is a combinatorial space, a large combinatorial space of possible messages, which has large gaps in between, so that when a message gets a little bit distorted and it falls in a gap, you can see that it doesn't belong, that it's not correct.
Mm-hmm.
And in the domain of oscillating systems and waves and resonance and stuff, it feels like that provides exactly that the quantized modes that fit, harmonics that fit in a string, for example, provide you a combinatorial space of possibilities, but the frequencies in between don't fit. And if you as you turn up the energy on a vibrating substrate, it flips discretely from one mode to another, from one harmonic to another. And that feels like the right sort of territory for getting combinatorials, a pseudo-discrete space, combinatorial space of possibilities from continuous substrates.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, from a quantum information point of view, there are no continuous substrates. And so it's all discrete in the end. And what your vibrating systems are doing is coarse graining at particular frequencies. So they're making macroscopic discrete states, which is fine.
Yeah.
But in the end, the question is always, is the frequency within some very small error bar of this interesting frequency or this preferred frequency or not? And if it is, then you have a 1, and if it's not, you have a 0. So you've created this discrete space.
Yeah.
And an error correcting code just needs a discrete space and redundancy.
Yeah.
So space or time, either one, provides redundancy. So if you have a discrete space in either space or time, you can construct an error correcting code.
So the cool thing about the oscillations, vibrations, and harmonics, though, is how you can that you pack one octave inside another, right? So that it's not just that you have a effectively discrete space of possibilities at one level of organization, but at the octave above, there are 2 wavelengths that fit with inside that, and at the octave above that, there are 4, and those are discrete too, and they have their own error correction stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
which is semi-independent of the octaves above and below, but not independent, because you also get the subharmonic phase locking between the levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that feels like the right kind of machinery for having multiscale autonomy, where there's a dynamical process going on at a particular level of organization that is semi-independent of the levels above or below. But you don't want it to be completely independent of the levels above or below, because then, well, for a number of reasons. One, because that doesn't explain what we want to explain in the biology, right? We want to explain how this process at this level interacts with that process at that level.
Right.
Yeah.
But in a sense, in a physical system that's a single physical system, you can't have independence between scales, right? You're going to have this coupling for free.
Yeah, the coupling is for free, but what's unusual is the slight independence, right? So the coupling of if I have two oscillators of a given frequency and they phase lock with each other, then that's a phenomenon that has it's like a causal process that operates at that scale of organization. But I can also get a phase locking between an oscillator and another oscillator at twice the frequency, and I don't, as one of those objects doesn't really know whether the other object is twice the frequency or half the frequency, twice the frequency or the same frequency. So there's a sort of crosstalk between levels that ordinarily, the temptation is to say, well, all of the levels above are determined by the levels below, so there isn't any autonomy going on at the high levels at all, and we don't need to talk about crosstalk between levels because there aren't really any levels. But when you have a resonance happening at a particular scale, that's a dynamical causal process at that scale, which is semi-independent of the scale below. Do you not think?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by semi-independent. I mean, one can think of this in terms of building detectors, right? If you have a base frequency, it's a kilohertz or something, then one can think about building a detector, an antenna at some lower frequency, and that process may be completely independent of whatever's going on at a kilohertz. But you will either do it in a way that you can capture a resonance or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do, then good for you. You've designed something that is a resonant detector even for this higher frequency signal.
Mm-hmm.
And that produces for you with your detector something that looks like a low frequency signal.
Mm-hmm.
But you could have designed the detector a little bit differently and gotten no resonance at all, and you wouldn't see a signal at your lower frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, there's complete independence.
Mm-hmm.
So what you see is not independent of what's going on at the lower level, but what you end up designing and building is independent of what's going on at the lower level.
Can I say that back to you, see if I got it? So suppose I was working in a low frequency space and I had one low frequency oscillator synchronizing with another low frequency oscillator, and everything appears to be low frequency and everything appears to be quite sensible. But then I noticed that at particular low frequencies, something weird happens, because I'm starting to detect something from the higher frequency that it's resonating with.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a causal process at this low frequency area, but at particular low frequency areas, there is an interaction with the high frequency thing, right?
Yeah.
And when that happens, assuming that the high frequency thing isn't just a transmitter, but that it's a physical process that's reversible, I'm also influencing the high frequency thing as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
It will synchronize with me and I synchronize with it as the resonance is mutual, not one way.
Yeah. Given that there's a little bit of slack in the high frequency process. Yeah. But you're going to be, if you're driving the low frequency process, you're going to be feeding energy into the high frequency process. So in a sense, the question about independence is, are there drivers at every scale? Which is one of the things that Mike talks about a lot in terms of processes going on at different scales that inject energy or information into a system at some particular scale.
Interesting. So you could have a high frequency oscillation that drives a low frequency one, and then the low frequency one could drive some other low frequency one, and then the second low frequency one could drive the high frequency one or another high frequency one, right? So you can have interactions at both scales, right? And you can't really tell who's the driver or whether the drive was introduced at that scale or came from the level below, can you?
I would say in general, no. If you're only making measurements at one scale.
When you're releasing energy at that scale in order to drive something at that scale, the process that was releasing energy was getting it from the scales below anyway. Right?
Getting it from somewhere, certainly.
Yeah. Even if you were just burning something, it was coming from there. Yeah.
That's an important point, in that we often tend to think about the power supply as a completely external part of the picture, but yeah, the power has to come from someplace, and it comes from, at the end of the day, it comes from the environment, which is the same place that the information that's being processed comes from.
Yeah.
So you can ask, how are those two coupled within the environment in hidden degrees of freedom that you can't see?
Yeah. I mean, it's the simple thing that, you start off learning about, sources and earths, sources and sinks. And then, later on you learn about back EMF and you think, oh shit, how did that happen? Right. I was supposed to think about that as, it was just it wasn't part of the system. It was just a source. Right. And now suddenly there is a way in which it becomes part of the system and it starts interacting backwards. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the sources and sinks they're the ways, they are the resonances which are losing or gaining energy from other scales of organization, right?
Or they're just a way of cheating. I mean, they're just a heuristic for not talking about the things you can't see.
Which are exactly the things that we want to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Could we talk for a minute about making observations and hopefully interventions at multiple scales or at larger scales, right? Because one of the things, one of the things that happens, so the kind of error correction that we think about all the time is, let's say you're a salamander, you've lost your arm or some part of it, and then the cells have to do the hard work of doing some stuff, but also the collective has to, and so on. But the thing they're correcting doesn't exist at the cellular level. So they went, they're going to have to correct the fact that there's half the number of fingers than there needs to be, but there's no notion of finger at the level of the single cell. So there are those stresses at the higher level have to be propagated down and sort of make the lower levels dance to some extent. But then when we take measurements and we take intervention and we make interventions, what happens is people will look at it and they say, oh, but you didn't actually intervene at this higher level, because I see what you did. You actually, you put in some ion channels, or you touched some kind of a chemical. Like, if you want to, you can always zoom into that lower level if you want to, right? So one of the things we've been grappling with is how to define when you've actually taken a measurement at a higher level, or worse yet, when you've done an intervention at a higher level. Because for measurements, you can talk about the integrated information and some stuff like that. So that's at least a little bit got going. But what does it mean to make an intervention at a higher level when you're talking to the collective in some sense, right? You're communicating with behavior shaping the collective and whatnot. How do we formalize that so that it's clear that, yes, I know I used a piece of DNA to do it, but I wasn't really manipulating the lower level. I was actually, it was just that was just the conduit. I was actually talking to the tissue level agent.
So I imagine the subharmonic phase locking, if that's the right way to think about it, right? So if I had a process that would have 4 peaks in that interval, and I have another process that has 2 peaks, then there's 2 ways of me locking onto that of the higher level process of locking onto it, right? And they're equally good, they're equally compatible, equally stress-free in their relationship to the lower level, to the higher frequency oscillation. And if I can push that higher frequency oscillation from locking like this to locking like that, that push is something that I don't know how to say it, except that the lower level is completely invisible to the lower level. It's perfectly happy with those 2 possibilities. But if this whole thing is really, one system with 2 waves carried in the same substrate, then, you say, I pushed it at this level, and somebody else says, well, you pushed it at that level, because it's the same system that you're pushing. But you have to make a case. Let's see, you'd have to make a case that I'm not pushing a thing, I'm pushing a frequency, and that pushing it at this frequency is relevant, is the same as saying I'm doing something causal at this scale, not at some other scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this comes down to the answer that I think you gave in lab meeting yesterday, Mike, which is it depends on what the theory is that tells you what the intervention should be. And if the theory that tells you to intervene with this probe is a macroscale theory, then in a sense you're intervening at the macroscale, because that's the informational context.
Yeah.
But the reductionists don't believe in macroscale theories.
Well, okay. I mean, you you can be that way, but try it with a computer scientist.
Yeah, that's what I was arguing yesterday in lab meeting that Chris is referring to, that after something interesting has been some interesting system has been prepared, you can then be a reductionist and say, well, I know what's going to happen next. You don't need any of these higher levels. But I think in addition to prediction, we need another, and I don't know how to formalize it yet, but we need another notion of like pre-invention or something, that measures something else. It measures how likely were you to come up with this in the first place, given given the level at which you operate. So it's the sort of thing that, like in the cellular automaton game of life, right? Once somebody prepares something, you don't need to believe in gliders. You can just track the states, and you can predict it all the way out. But if you don't believe in gliders, you're never going to make the thing that is, when somebody made this Turing machine and out of gliders, right? Where like you're not going to be able to do that if you don't believe in those levels. And the same thing happens. Sometimes I'll give a talk and people say that's really interesting data, but why you keep talking about all this philosophical stuff? Don't do that. Just do the experiments. And the answer is, well, we wouldn't have done this experiment without that way of thinking about it. So it's not, after the fact, after I show you the two-headed worms that, repeating or whatever, then anybody can say, well, of course it's chemistry underneath and it's genetics. I mean, I can track it down. Yes, you can after the fact.
To which they'll say, well, I don't care what's going on inside your head. I don't care what your theory generating process was. That's not part of the system I'm studying. I'm only interested in the worms and their molecules. And how you came up with that theory is not part of the system I'm interested in. And how you came up with it doesn't affect what the system is that I'm looking at from their point of view, right?
To which a good response is, so tell me again what a worm is. I mean, you're talking about the difference between trigonometry and arithmetic, right? It's very convenient to have this thing we call sine, but we don't need it. I mean, all we actually need is addition and multiplication, right? So do projective geometry with just addition and multiplication.
Yeah, but so I'll continue to be the reductionist advocate for a bit. It's like, yeah, I'm not sure I really believe in worms, right? There's only biomolecules and there's only genes and they're just vehicles. The only agents here, if there's any kind of agent, is a gene, and that's not really an agent either. It's just a molecule. And all of your worries about whether that's one individual or two individuals or one worm or two worms, or that's just the downstream consequences of the real causal process happening at the lower level.
But is it not the case that, okay, so we have competing lenses on things, and then one has to choose one, right? Or not forever, but for some particular stretch. And so how do we choose between them? So the reductionist lays out their lens, I will lay out my lens, and then now we must choose. And so how do we choose? Because this is very foundational, right? And neither, it's easy within one frame to sort of make fun of the other and say, you're talking about things that don't exist, but the decision between them has to be made sort of above that, and we need some sort of criteria. And so, no,
I think you have to read Ian's book first, right? To recognize that the logic of the left brain locks out the possible existence of any other kind of way of thinking, but the reasoning of the right brain doesn't, right? The right brain can see the whole and it can see the parts, and the left brain just says, fuck off, I can only see the parts. But there isn't anything else except my own logic. How do you know? I refer to my own logic, right? And it's caught in this loop that it can't get out of.
Who is Ian in this case?
Ian
McGilchrist. Yeah, we had a couple of meetings recently. He's written some really interesting stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I try to sort of boil it down to pull it out of philosophy, where people have been debating this for I don't know how long, and to say that, well, we need some way of deciding between these frames at any given moment. There are different ways of looking at things, and one way is the degree of facilitation of future progress, right? I mean, I don't know what else you would choose. Efficiency is one, but okay, maybe that's it's not the only thing. But does it help you?
Well, yeah, computational complexity is a measure that can be substituted for efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sure, do it all in string theory. But it's much easier to make coffee at a macroscale. And the reason is you aren't trying to do some exponential computation.
So what about
not just aesthetics?
What about well, essentially the multiple realizability of the lower levels? So suppose I claim to have a process operating between units at a particular scale, operated on at a particular frequency. And for this particular instantiation of that process, they were built on top of some other particular units at the scale below. But if the causal process had some independence from the things below, and you wanted to prove that it did, you could say, look, I can do the same thing in a system that is either, locked differently, so that, when it's over here, I do the same thing and I get the same result. When it's over here, I do the same thing and I get the same result. But the genes that changed when I did it here are those genes, and the genes that changed when I did it there are those genes. So they can't be the cause because they were different in those two cases.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference maker has to be what was happening at the higher level of organization, not what was at the lower level of organization. And then there's the possibility that that's not just a different phase lock, but that it's an entirely different kind of system, right? That that I replaced my gene signaling pathway with a morphogen pathway that went outside the cell or did something else or was electrical or something like that. It doesn't matter so long as it provided the appropriate oscillation for the other thing to live on. And then you can't say that it was the lower level thing that did it. I mean,
this is a good reason to try to teach all biology students the theory of virtual machines. Because that's the best example we've got. Just transporting
now, so
zoom between my Linux machine and Mike's Microsoft machine and whatever you're running.
A really badly limping along Windows machine, yeah.
So, I mean, the fact that works is undeniable evidence for the utility of high-level descriptions.
Because is it undeniable?
Without that, you couldn't do it just from an engineering point of view.
Yeah, but is it undeniable evidence for the existence of a higher level causal process rather than a higher level description?
Well, the program is just a description of what a piece of hardware is doing. So not in any fundamental sense, but in a pragmatic sense, yes. I actually write programs in a programming language, not with wires and a soldering iron. And I could never construct Zoom. Well, I could never construct Zoom anyway, but I certainly couldn't construct it with wires and a soldering iron. And no one else could either. That's
yeah.
To sort of in another way of asking this, maybe simplified, could you play chess against a proper reductionist, right? Because what would their next move be? So they don't believe in pieces, they don't believe in boards, they don't believe in the relationship between the pieces. There are microstates. All the microstates, like the Library of Babel, they all look the same to them, right? In a certain sense. How would you make the next move if you didn't believe in this thing?
Oh, but that's because they don't believe in themselves either. They would say, well, all of my microstates create this process that plays chess against all of your microstates, but they don't believe in themselves as an agent that took a decision about what move to do.
This suggests an old adage, which one wins arguments only with technologies.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. I wonder if I might change tack a little bit to talk about the kind of computation that we can do with physical systems and with oscillations and stuff, if that's okay. So the talk that you saw, Chris, would have been about the mechanism that I call natural induction.
Yes, I think that was correct.
So you have a dynamical system described by a network of viscoelastic connections. And its natural behavior is to find local minima in its energy function. But as it spends time at each of those configurations, the viscoelastic connections give way slightly, which makes the attractor of that particular configuration a bit larger. And then you perturb the state and it goes to another attractor, and the relaxation of the connections makes that one a bit larger, so that it forms a memory of its own past behavior. And as that memory is in the connections and not in the states, it's a memory which can generalize, so that it's not just making it more likely to go to configurations that it's been to before, but also to other configurations, including novel ones that have the same associative relationships between the state components. So that process of back and forth between what I would now call physical optimization is just local energy minimization, and physical learning of changes to the internal structure of the system, coupled with one another, produces an optimization process that the change in the state modifies the energy function, and the change in the energy function modifies the state trajectories, and it causes the state trajectories to find exceptionally low energy configurations, even in the original constraints, even in the original springs. Those are configurations which are exceptionally low energy. So I understand that to be a mechanism of adaptation. There's a whole other story about that isn't natural selection. That's a different story. But in order to make it work, it needs to be, I notice a couple of things. One is that the way in which the springs push the masses and the way in which the masses deform the springs needs to be reversible. If this dynamical system was like a regular neural network, which has fires if the weighted sum of inputs is over a threshold, then that's not reversible. I can't put a current back down the axon and get it to change the weights, right? The backprop does that, but I can't literally push on it. It's a one-way system. So the natural induction process is kind of nice because it's a purely physical system. It doesn't need to be designed or selected for the purpose of doing adaptation, but it only works in physical systems that have that reversibility. The other thing that I notice about it is that there's a shift between the configuration space in which the states move and the configuration space in which the weights move, which is that one is the correlations of the other. That one is the state space is the straightforward state configuration space, but the changes in the weights change the correlations of the other one. Mm-hmm. And if you were to have, if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing recursively, then the next level would be the sort of higher order correlations between those correlations would be controlled with another kind of spring that connects two springs together. And if that was all reversible, then you ought to be able to get it to do a deep learning process instead of just an associative learning process. And that all feels to me like the implicate order of bone. Shall I get your reflection on that first before I add more layers of thought onto it?
I mean, I think what Bohm was trying to talk about is entanglement and the difference between quantum and classical information.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about here is, one could think of as kind of the first two terms in a series expansion, where if you take the whole expansion, you have entanglement.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That sounds like that is resonating with you a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a nice long ago paper by, what's the guy's name? Frank Tipler. He's kind of an odd character. But what he shows is that if you take standard Laplacian classical mechanics and you remove all the singularities that exist in classical mechanics, because everything is a hard boundary. And so, you have collisions and they're instantaneous. And so you have singularities in the momentum. If you remove all those singularities by smoothing them out, then you get Bohmian quantum mechanics. And so, the reason is that smoothing out the singularities is the same thing as connecting everything to everything else.
Yeah. That makes total sense to me, actually.
And I thought that was a really nice demonstration. It's a paper in PNAS from 2014 or something like that. I could dig it up and send it to you if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll ping you if I can't find it.
Yeah. And the other part of the paper is a vigorous defense of Laplacian, which turns out to be the same as Bayesian theory of probability.
Right. So I've been thinking about it this way, right? In a deep neural network with a feed-forward architecture, you are getting one layer to provide inputs that controls the next layer. Each layer is, multiple inputs feeding in. It's losing information. It's coarse graining stuff as you go up. Mm-hmm. And if it does it in an all or nothing, +1, -1 way, a discrete way, then it's not reversible. And you can't push, if the output wasn't what you wanted, you can't push back on it to know how to change the weights or to know who was responsible for the error. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we use a sigmoidal function is so that you can differentiate it, so that you can get rid of those singularities you were just mentioning, so that you can given the error, you can use the error to push back on the weights and do the credit assignment of who was responsible for this error, and thus change the weights, deform the weights to give you a slightly better answer. And that reversibility is necessary for you to do learning, right? Learning is, I had an error in the coarse-grained, low-dimensional space that I didn't like, and I want to know how can I reverse engineer all of the changes that I need to make to the internal organization of my machine in order to change that error. And if everything is reversible, well, then you can just push on it, and it gives you the changes that you want. It just bends it to give you the changes that you want. But if everything is reversible, then you can't do the non-linearly separable deep functions that you actually want to compute, right? The purpose of having a deep network with nonlinearities in it is so that you can fold the feature space and fold it again and fold it again and fold it again, so that you can have complex decision boundaries in the space. And although each layer was a little bit reversible because you didn't use a step function, you used a sigmoid, it nonetheless becomes more and more difficult to reverse that function as the function becomes more and more folded, that it becomes so massively underdetermined that, you know, you have to push it by infinitesimally tiny little bits if you want to change a fold that you've made that's quite deep. That's hard to do, right? So in deep learning, the way that that manifests is after I've trained the network on a particular function, I'm basically fucked if I wanted to do something else, right? I can't change the deep structure in that network without undoing all of the higher level folds that I made so that I can see that deep structure, push it to do something else, and then put all those folds back again. I can't change the deep correlations, the really, really low frequency stuff, without undoing all of the high frequency stuff that I put on top. Now, my hypothesis is that if we did a neural network that was built out of oscillators with periodic activation functions instead of sigmoids, and we did the computation in phase space instead of amplitude space, then it could do all of the same kind of computation. But the thing that would be different is, like, why would you want to do that? If it's equivalent, why bother doing the conversion? The reason is because you could change the deep correlations in the network without having to undo all of the high frequency correlations in the network, because you could just hum to it at the low frequency, and that would turn the low frequency or the base of the orbit around in that low frequency space without having to undo. You could drill through the higher frequency folds and leave them untouched to communicate directly with the low dimensional folds.
So you would have to know what frequency your error is occurring at. And then you would have to know how to correct for the side effects of changing the low frequency slightly in terms of the resonance or off resonance behavior of all of the higher frequency components.
Yes.
So I'm not sure you get away with leaving all the higher frequency components fixed, even in this kind of Fourier representation.
Yeah, my feeling is that the high frequency ones are just as happy locked in a different phase as they were in the original phase.
Might change the semantics, though.
Well, up might be down, but they would be a reflection that still had the same internal relationships, right? It's a left hand instead of a right hand, but it's still a hand. And the way that you wouldn't, how would you know which frequency the error was at, right? It's like, well, you don't, because the way in which you're interacting with the network when it's a low frequency thing that needs changing is because that was a causal process that was happening at the low frequency. So the causal process can happen between, when one organism interacts with another, for example, the kinds of interactions that they have could be a really low frequency thing or a really high frequency thing. Like they could be having a conversation, or they could be physically bumping into each other in the street. And the response that you get is a change in the internal organization of the system either way. But one could be changing something deep without, I'm changing the ideas inside your head without breaking your skull. And the other one breaks your skull without changing the ideas inside your head, right? So those causal processes are happening, can happen between an organism and its environment or another agent, if the environment is communicating with it, enacting causal processes at that scale.
I mean, some living things facilitate that by providing an interface which is learning, rewards and punishments and perception and all that, for letting others modify them in a particular way without having to get in there and literally change their neuronal contents, right? I mean, who was it that I forget who it was, but somebody gave a talk on how to give a talk, and the first thing he said is, he said effective communication is a violent act, because fundamentally your goal, if you're good at it, your goal is to reach in there and make sure the people that leave leave in the audience are not the same way they came in. Right? But you need to, they have to facilitate that by being by having that interface and being the kind of thing.
I repeated that to Eva, and she said, "Why does it have to be violent?"
Wasn't my fault. I didn't come up with this one. Wasn't. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe violence not the best word, but there's an element of this in there, because by coming to a lecture, you are taking a risk. You don't know what you're going to leave there with, right? You might hear something. You can't unhear things. You might hear, or you might see a piece of art or read something. I've certainly had that experience, like, wow, I wish I hadn't read that. But it's too late. Once you see it, you can't unsee things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Any communicative act is exerting forces on you which transform you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've often said
one
that
frequency or another.
Talk therapy and drug therapy are not all that different.
Yeah.
Well, and
they both do basically the same thing.
Yeah, Chris, I don't know if you were at that lab meeting we had, but Fabrizio Benedetti, who gave that talk on the placebo effects and everything, he had he had the slide that said drugs and words have the same mechanism of action.
Nice.
And that he gave an hour lecture, and that was amazing. It was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I didn't see that. That's very cool. I would have.
It was fantastic. He didn't want us to record it, so I don't have a recording of it, but it was really good. Yeah.